Today we'll be critiquing the literary concept of the death of the author, written by Roland Barthes in his 1967 essay that is titled in French but means the death of the author. And so I'll be going over the key points that are made in this essay. So the first one would be separating the author from text. So this basically means that the meaning of a text, in a general sense, should not be tied to the author's biography, intentions, or personal views. And this one is more of a shake my head, rattle my brain type of situation, where in some ways it makes sense. For example, if you are linking what the author wrote to their personal lives, meaning that maybe an author is writing about something that is maybe in your society quite scandalous. And so just make an example of horror or the new kid on the block, violent video games. Then just because you make such content, it doesn't mean that you want that to happen in real life. But it's more that you are just simply exploring the topic for personal enjoyment. And so none of the readers should point at you or someone who enjoys gore, real life gore, or whatever controversial topic that you are talking about. And so to that extent, I can agree with it if this is what is being meant by it. Because you will see, even in 2025, that people still try to connect what an author creates towards their personal life as a way to judge them, which usually shows a level of ignorance when it comes to the creative process, as there are many reasons why an author can choose to create a work, exploration just being one of them. But then there's the other interpretation that I have of this that I actually disagree with, which would be meaning that, and this is connected to the second point, but it basically takes away the very purpose of storytelling, or rather, it's not the whole purpose of storytelling, but it was surely the original purpose. Because if we do take away the intentions of the author, especially their personal views, but I feel like you can take away to a certain degree their personal views, but you must know that you wouldn't be able to criticize the story correctly because you wouldn't know the context in which they are writing it in. But you can't take away the intentions, because a lot of stories, if not most stories, are made with the intention of teaching a specific lesson. And so the lesson that the author is trying to give is important and should be taken as the first priority. And of course, as I said before, if you don't do this, then it becomes impossible to judge the story, which basically means that it's impossible to improve on storytelling in a general sense. The second point being that readers play an active role in creating the meaning of the text. Interpretation is not fixed or solely determined by the author, which, as I said before, is connected to the first one. Doesn't really make all that much sense when you dig beneath the surface, as it renders the argument, or rather the conversation of a story's quality, meaningless, because to begin to criticize something, we need to first know its original point. And actually, the more I read this list, let me just read the other two, where it says here that text independence. Once a work is published, it exists independently of the author, allowing for multiple potentially conflicting interpretations. Critique of authorial intent. Emphasizing authorial intent limits the potential meanings and interpretations of a text, restricting the richness of literary analysis. And no, this doesn't make sense. So I would say that this is basically catering to, at best, like fan fiction interpretations of a story. And the beautiful thing on one hand about fan fictions is that if you are writing something of high quality, people should just tell you that you should make that story. And the same could be said when it comes to interpretation of a story, that if you don't care for the author's intent and what they were actually trying to teach you, and then you actually received a totally different message from the show itself, then please go out and make that story, because we want to read that story. We also want to read that story. We also want to engage in your thoughts. I would say that in some ways, death of the author is helpful to only the audience, and it only thinks of a work through an audience perspective, so to speak, a reader's perspective, but it inevitably destroys the potential for more stories to exist in the world, because a lot of stories that exist today exist because they were inspired by what people thought was the meaning of the one that was told to them. And so when they discovered that that wasn't the meaning of the text, they weren't sad about it, but they decided to create that work that they thought about. They decided to learn about literature, to learn how to write, and to learn how to tell a story. And then they made that story. And so what death of the author hopefully unintentionally does, is inhibit storytelling and the creation of more stories. And of course, once again, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I feel that the concept of death of the author, at least certain concepts in it, are applicable to an author themselves, where I believe death of the author should be applied based off of what the author themselves wants. And so they themselves will tell you that you should apply death of the author when reading my story, because I have no inherent message to give, but I'm mostly, for example, a world building author. So they just writing their story for world building sense, and they don't have any message to tell you, but they're just exploring their world through the characters, and the characters are literally just doing whatever they want. And I'm thinking of like a recent example of this, but I can't remember the name of it. But essentially, it applies to authors that are making interpretive works. And I know that you can make the argument that that in and of itself is an intention of the author and therefore circumvents the concept of death of the author. But I would say, if we just kept it simple, that an author should be able to say, well, you should apply death of the author to my work, because it really is your journey more than it is my story. And another situation I think death of the author could apply would be when the author themselves sells the story. And even then, the further context would be they sell the story and then have no creative freedom in it, or creative control rather, because at that point I feel like the story becomes more of a product rather than something that is or has intention towards the readers. At that point I feel like the readers themselves are just as part of the storytelling as the writers themselves. But I would say even then, with further context into that it would have to be when the author themselves, the original author, or the writers are basically contradicting and changing the story willy-nilly to suit their own narratives or something of that nature. At that point, I feel that the story has degraded to the point of just being a fan fiction house where everything is meaningless, because basically anything can happen in the story at that point. And so with that in mind, I believe the concept that a text can have a life of its own, separate from its creators, does make sense, but I really don't think that should be the common thing that should happen, widely accepted or anything of that matter, because it kind of circumvents what storytelling is in the end, or rather it circumvents what most stories are in the end. So I can understand if somebody disagrees with me on this, although I would say that you'd need to make a comprehensive argument as to why so. And if you do, at best, I think that the conclusion would be that the power of death of the author should still belong to the author themselves, where they can have that control over the series to say that, oh, it is its own thing. It's something I'm just putting out into the world, or it is something that I actually have a lesson to give. And I feel that in the end, I can come up with other reasons as to why death of the author can exist. For example, maybe an author is making statements about the work outside of the work itself, which at that point I think that should be ignored, meaning the statements not just being any statements, but it means that they are arbitrarily adding concepts into a character or traits to a character after the story is finished that doesn't really serve the story that has been told, and just shows that they've been pressured by the outside world to do so. But that being very different from an author simply clarifying on the meaning of a certain character's journey, which I find to be acceptable, especially if it is clear to see. But yes, that's all I have to say on this. I think it's a controversial type of topic, but I hope I was able to give my own reasons as to why I would rather either discard it or rather give the reins to the author on that subject matter, depending on their story. But with that, that's the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.